WCLN 1170 Radio and Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We Should Know is on there. I want to thank you for being with us today. We're coming to you on Tuesdays, each and every Tuesday at 2:30, Star Communications and WCLN Radio. There's also a replay at 7 p.m. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. A week or so ago, we got a little bit off track with the replays. I got a number of calls. The scheduled time for those replays remains at 7 p.m. Oftentimes equipment failure or something may or may not happen. We did get off schedule on that, and I feel I need to mention that and apologize for anything that may happen along those lines. There's also a summation in Samson Weekly newspaper. This past week's show, of course, the National Weather Service, and we felt it important to get that in. Today we're talking about something that's near and dear to everybody, no matter who you are, no matter where you are. It's history, and we have with us today Chris Woodson. Chris, thank you for being with us today, and you're the director of the Sampson County History Museum.
Right.
Chris, I was looking at your background, and I found it interesting that the more I read about where you had been, a graduate of New Hanover High School in Wilmington, North Carolina, of course, Lee's McGray College at Banner Elk, a bachelor's degree in history. You're a veteran, U.S. Marine, National Guard, served in Field Artillery Unit during the Persian Gulf War, 1990 and 1991. 15 years with North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources, and we'll talk about some other things that you were involved in as the show goes on. But first of all, let me thank you for your military service and what you've done for this country. Oftentimes that goes unspoken, but I like to call it out here and just thank people for stepping up and serving this country.
No problem, thanks.
Okay, so let's talk about history and kind of a broad perspective before we get into the unbelievable stuff that's going on down at the History Museum. Give us a sense of why history should be important to us, not only individually as a society. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, it's history. It's one of those universal things that runs, throughout society. Whether it's something that happened 1,000 years ago, or we've got stuff going on right now with the presidential election and everything in between. And no matter what type of history it is, or how far back or how recent, it's constantly shaping who we are, constantly shaping the decisions we make and the way we carry on our day-to-day lives, and things that we don't even realize maybe at the time that are of great significance. A few years down the road, we'll look back and it'll all make sense. So it's a constantly evolving, changing thing that's directly impacting us on a day-to-day basis.
A lot of folks listening will probably remember those history courses in high school or history books that they had to carry around, and they many people will say, well, history is so boring. When you talk about it shaping who we are now, is our reflection of what history is based on the factual reality of history, how fuzzy does that get at times? And as a person with a degree in history and obviously a great interest in history, how is it important for you to make sure we get that right?
I think it's very important because, like you just mentioned, it does get a little fuzzy when you get a few years down the road and you start looking back, and we tend to look at things a little more fondly than perhaps they really were, and we tend to focus on the good. I think it's just human nature. We tend to focus on the good rather than dwell on some of the negative stuff. And I think that's where things like museums, the history courses we take in school, the books we read, documentaries, I think that's where they come into play to kind of strike that balance between what we remember and what really was.
And a lot of, I think when we talk about museums, we think about various kinds of artifacts. And over the past, I'll say, year or so, we've seen an interest in some folks in destroying some artifacts or reminders of history that were not the greatest moments in human existence. And they say we need to get rid of those and we don't need to think about that anymore. What's your thoughts on that as it relates to history?
Oh gosh, that's
well, it's kind of broad and it's deep, but I think it adjusts where we're going as a society to some degree.
Yeah, that's a great question because it is very current. We've seen recently with things like the Civil War monuments or the Confederate flag issues and things like that. And my take on it as somebody in the history field is that it sort of sounds a little flippant, but it is what it is. I mean, it's part of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm personally not in favor of whitewashing over it or trying to sanitize it, because that gets back into, we tend to look at the past through rose-colored glasses or a little fuzzier than maybe it really was. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to bring all these things out into the open from our past, whether, it may have some negative associations or, it may upset some people, and some people may feel very strongly about it in the other direction, but I think it's important to keep that out in the open, to keep those debates going, and to continue learning from it. I think one of the best examples I can think of at the museum here in Clinton, we have on display an original Confederate flag that was made by some of the schoolgirls in Clinton during the Civil War, and I understand the opposition to that in principle or the spirit behind it, but as a historical artifact, this is a 150-year-old flag that was made right here in Sampson County by these local girls, and we want to do what we can to preserve that, not so much to honor one part of the past or another part of the past, but as a relic from our collective history. And it's not just local history or Southern history or U.S. history, it's all it's all part of our national fabric.
I think one of the articles I read and kind of doing a little research and preparing for this show talked about history being one subject that could create more emotions instantaneously than anything else you could discuss or anything else that you could bring forth, depending on what proposed fact that you brought forth. You agree with that?
It can definitely generate a lot of emotions, no doubt.
Well, and an example of that would be someone like yourself that served in military service, and you look back at some of the horrific occurrences with the name, and that's tied directly to the name of Hitler and what happened in concentration camps. It is unbelievable at the emotions that brings forward, not just from the military community of veterans that served, but from the people and victims of the impact of that war. I think that's what it was speaking to as what history was.
Right.
So let's talk, and I want to try to get to some meaty parts of the kind of general picture, but James McPherson, who he's actually president of the American History Society, one of his quotes I found very interesting. He said, he was basically showing a group of CEOs and their wives around Gettysburg. You mentioned Civil War history, so that spawned me to mention this. And he said, as folks walked around and looked, they started a conversation between what a historical timeline is and what history is as it relates to fiction and nonfiction. And he said what he looked at was what was the difference, he asked. One of the folks asked him, what's the difference between that as a novelist who invents plausible dialogue or actions, and the historian, the person that's a historian, who builds the narrative on a fragmentary or often ambiguous sense of evidence? How important is it for a historian to look at actual facts through artifacts or other evidence to say this is actually what happened? And as you just said, oftentimes it might not be the prettiest thing. It might not be what we really remember as being the most sweet-smelling flower at the time, but at the same moment, there's a sense and need to make sure it is factual and it's consistent.
I think that's incredibly important. That's really at the heart of what historians do. It's at the heart of what museums do. I don't think it's too far afield to say it's a sacred duty that we have in the history business to not only preserve and interpret history, but to make sure we preserve and interpret it correctly and from all the different angles and all the different impacts it's had on various elements of society. It's very dangerous, in my opinion, to get a very one-sided view of history, because it is such a dynamic thing that impacts so many people, and you have to be very careful with that when you're presenting it to the public, whether it's like the books, James McPherson, or the documentaries, or your local county history museum. You want to try to give the complete picture of what was going on in the past. It's, like I said, it's a sacred duty, in my opinion.
The piece of this that we're going to get to after we come back from our first break is a lot of the artifacts which sets the stage, and you've already mentioned some of those artifacts. But artifacts themselves, as it relates to the pieces of history, whether it's a cannonball or whether it's a flag or maybe it's an obscure handwritten note from a general or some leader at the time, the preservation of that, how critical is that?
It's very critical. These, in a lot of cases, these are one-of-a-kind items that sounds cliche, but once they're gone, and we have to do everything we can to preserve them. Again, in that mindset of it being a sacred duty, when we take something into our collection, people bring in things and donate things, we do that with the understanding that we're going to take the best care of it as possible. And there are times when we have to be honest and say we can't take this because we aren't going to be able to properly preserve it, or it doesn't fit with what we do here at the museum. So
we're going to take a break. We're going to come back and get into some of those artifacts and details of the museum. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Chris Woodson. We'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned. Call a friend. We're talking about your history.
You're out for an evening on the town. Finally a chance to relax and forget that you left your front door completely unlocked. Fortunately, you just installed a security system from Star Communications. With just your cell phone, you can check on your house, lock it down, light it up, and get back to relaxing.
You forgot to put Buster in his crate.
Unfortunately, we can't help with that. Security and automation from Star Communications. Call today to find out more.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's good to be with you today. We're talking about history. We're talking about history in general, the importance of history. Particularly, we're talking about history in Sampson County, and we're talking with Chris Woodson, who is the director of the Sampson County History Museum. Chris, we gave a little bit of background about your military background, your degree in history, which I think dovetails well with being the director of the History Museum. Also, I want to mention 15 years with the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources at Fort Fisher, the historic site there. You were volunteer staff at Curry Beach, Roanoke Island, Festival Park Museum Specialist, Manteo, North Carolina, Museum of Cape Fear Historical Complex, Educational Programming, Fayetteville, North Carolina, married to someone called Stephanie. You have 2 grown children. I must say you don't look like you're old enough to have 2 grown children, but it goes fast, doesn't it?
Thank you. Yes, it does.
So we give all of your to your children a shout out. I particularly want to just give a quick salute to David and Jeannie King, who worked very hard at the museum prior to your taking over the realm of that. And David is also working with a historical project on the state level with the North Carolina Highway Patrol. That is the last time I talked with him. So hopefully that is still going on with them. And also in that chain of history was Fest Turlington as well, which even dates further back. When you came to Sampson County, I want to get to this piece, which is also part of the history. You have to look at all the places you've been. What brought you and what kind of attracted you and put you in the soil of Sampson County, not being from this area?
Good question. Interesting. I worked, as you mentioned previously, with the Museum of the Cape Fear over in Fayetteville up until 2011, and we got hit with the budget cuts, and it's a state history museum, and lost about half our staff, and I was one of those. And at that point, it was just kind of a transitional period of my life. My wife and I just looking to get out in the country. We're both from Wilmington, and we wanted to find somewhere that was still kind of, within close proximity to the Triangle area and close proximity to the coast, and just started house hunting and kind of fell in love with the area during our riding around all through the back roads between Raleigh and Wilmington.
You just hit one of the biggest selling points I tell folks that Sampson County has is proximity. We're close to everything, but we don't have traffic jams.
Right, that was part of our theory. We felt like we were just a little too far from the Triangle to worry about bedroom communities springing up, in the same way with Wilmington, so felt like we were close enough yet still able to maintain that small town atmosphere, and that's one of the things we really enjoy about living here.
And transportation, I think, is improving greatly, which will make a huge difference. So when you moved here, now you came here in 2011, is that correct?
Right.
And you took over the job at the museum in what year?
Just last year.
Okay, so this has been not only a change for you in the sense of relocating your life, it has not been such a change I wouldn't expect for you from continuing your saga as a historian and so forth at the museum. What's one of the unique things that if you see at the Sampson County Historical Museum when you look at your other history of life, where you were looking at a much broader area of history? What's unique about Sampson County's Historical Museum that maybe you have not seen in other places?
I think with this museum here, compared to other places I've been within the state system, this is a very, very personal museum. It's local people from around the county, local artifacts. We have any given day, we'll have somebody come in who can point to that picture and say, oh, that's my great-grandfather, or oh, I remember when my mom had that piano in her living room, that kind of thing. It's a very personal experience, whereas my previous experience was more on a regional level. Museum of the Cape Fear, we covered the whole history of southeastern North Carolina. And Roanoke Island, we dealt with Outer Banks history and early explorations of North Carolina. And then when I was down at Fort Fisher working on the volunteer staff, we of course dealt primarily with Civil War history. So it's been a lot of different types of history, whereas this, I think all these different types of histories all come to play here at the Sampson County Museum, but on a much more personal and local level.
So folks that are listening from any of the counties that we cover, either by radio or television, and it could be anywhere from Wake County to down to Bladen or Pender County, to be honest with you, you would recommend maybe they drive to Clinton to take a look at this and not get caught into the glimpse, because when they actually look at the property, they see one building, but it's a part of a 9-building structure housed on 2 acres of property.
Right. That's one of the biggest comments we get when people come through the front door and start the full tour. They don't realize that there's all those other buildings out back. We have several buildings that were purpose-built for certain exhibits like law enforcement or sports. And then we have also historic structures that were moved from elsewhere in the county and reopened as part of the museum complex. So it's a real diverse amount of history back there that you really don't catch at all if you're just riding down Lisbon Street and see the house there.
I want to talk about some of those buildings that are there, and as I mentioned those, you can kind of elaborate a bit on not only the history that building brings, but some of the historical significance of that. And of course, in the main building, that's the 2-story White House that is visible clearly from Lisbon Street, and that's 313 Lisbon Street. What are some of the interesting things that folks might find in that building that they may not be expecting?
Okay, when you first come in that building, that was the original, housed the original museum, and you mentioned David and Jeannie King. That building, we have a medical exhibit with all kinds of information and artifacts pertaining to the various doctors and dentists around the county, dating all the way back to the 1800s. We have kitchen in there that's sort of, we kind of call it a retro kitchen, sort of like you might see on Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best. And then we also have a Kahari Indian, and I'm never sure, Kahari,
Right.
Indian exhibit that covers the Native American culture of the county. And we've temporarily, and I'd be remiss if I don't mention this because it's one of our big projects that's looming on the horizon, we've currently using part of that building for our military collection because the building that we were using had developed some structural issues and was no longer fit for keeping these artifacts secure. So those are the different things you'll see if you just come in that first building.
Is that building itself, and you mentioned 2 or 3 different things I think was important there. One is the Kahari tribal nation that's here, and which is a huge part, Native Americans is a huge part of our culture and what we represent as a country. Is there enough room, or is there an interest in doing something standalone kind of building or structure for Native Americans?
I think so. It's one of the tribes a lot of people haven't heard of unless, it was very specific to, say, Sampson, Harnett counties. A lot of people aren't aware of it, but it's also a very well organized, very cohesive group. The folks, the cultural center out on 421 here, they're very active with the powwows and classes and gardening and things like that. And I think it, at some point down the road, it would, definitely be, material enough for a standalone building of some sort.
You mentioned something I want to follow up on before I miss that, the significance of the structures and maintaining the structures. Funding-wise, talk to us a bit about the kind of funding you have and what you see going forward as we talk about some of these buildings, because I want people to associate that you just can't take these things, lay them in a building, walk away, and everything's going to be perfect. It requires upkeep, it requires maintenance, it requires just simply making sure the roof is not leaking. Tell us what you see budget-wise is going to be a need as this historic location continues to move forward.
Okay, our primary sources of fund mainly from Sampson County and then also from the city of Clinton, and then we also have private donors or Friends of the Museum. So those are our 3 main sources of funding. And it's a challenge, just like with any nonprofit, funding, and that's universal across the museum field or state historic sites, art museums, any type of museum that's dependent on public funding. Like you mentioned, we have these buildings that they all have air conditioning units, they all have roofs that can leak. Same thing we deal with, at home, with our households, same types of issues, and all those things, cost money. And what I see as far as the growth related to that is it's just going to have to be that slow and steady wins the race. We got lots of things we want to do, lots of things we hope to do, some in the near future and some on down the road, but it all is dependent on that funding. And
for a person to really get a perspective of it, though, they really need to just go down and take a look so they can understand if they support it financially themselves personally, if they're willing to contact their folks that run the government here in the county and say, look, the museum needs support. They really need to look at it before they dismiss it. Would you agree with that would be a key?
Oh, exactly. And there's really 3 components to it. You want people to come through the door because you have to justify your existence, but for them to come in the door, they have to see. There has to be something for them to see, and all that goes to the 3rd component, which is the funding. So it's this kind of a circle of life thing with the funding issues, and if we don't have people coming through the door, then the county is going to say, hey, we've got no reason to, give y'all money.
Absolutely.
And if we've got nothing in there to see, people don't have any reason to come through the door. So it's.
We'll be back in a moment. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in one moment. Stay with us.
Whether it's video, voice, internet, or cellular, Star Communications connects you to the things you love. It's what we do and have done for over 50 years. Star Communications, your local technology company.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're kind of halfway show. We're talking about history today. I want to thank all those folks at the radio station that mention us each and every week, and also mention what is coming up on Star Communications, Channel 16, WCLN Radio, the morning show with Grandpa, Nolan Z, the L-Man. Also, I want to mention Wayne Weeks with the Gospel Hour. The person that introduces this show each week, Nicole, we appreciate you introducing the show for us. Also, your efforts and dynamic with something called The Country Store each and every day. Tommy the Fly in the afternoon. And of course, on Saturday afternoon, Robert Stroud with the Boogie Shoes Radio Network. I want to thank Robert for mentioning our show. Oftentimes I go and I have a few moments to sit with him and chat and enjoy that. So we've got a big dynamic right here in Sampson County. We got somewhat of a newcomer to the county, a guy that's steeped in history, a fellow by the name of Chris Woodson that we're talking to today. And Chris, a lot of folks are listening to us on radio. Some folks have, at least on my side of the table, the unfortunate capability of actually seeing me on the TV side. The reality is of what we're talking about today is something that you've been steeped in for a long time, and that's history. And you're now found yourself as the director of the Sampson County History Museum. And as we went off air a while ago for a break, we talked about and we're talking about some of the buildings on a 2-acre property at 313 Lisbon Street in Clinton that make up the History Museum in Sampson County. You mentioned the main house and some of the stuff that was in there. The next building that comes to mind is something called the Law Enforcement Museum. Is that fairly fair to say it's a modern structured building? The building itself doesn't have a huge historical significance other than maybe the community college helped build it and put it on the property.
Right, it's one of the newer buildings on the property, and it's got a really neat collection in there of law enforcement artifacts, photographs going all the way back to the mid-19th century. And of course, David King, who was director for a long time, had an extensive background with the Highway Patrol and the Clinton City Police Department, and it's just a really neat building. We've got an old jail cell from the town jail. We've got a convict transport car that was horse-drawn. And that, some of these things are maybe not one of a kind exactly, but definitely some interesting items you're not going to see everywhere in every museum.
When you have, and I'll use this word, it's thrown around a lot, the millennials, which is kind of that age group that is between the folks like me and folks maybe down in their 20s and early 20s. That group of people come through that maybe have just, do you kind of see a sense of shock when they go particularly to the Law Enforcement Museum, because there's some artifacts in there that go back to, I should say, my day in the 70s when I was involved in law enforcement, and even back to my father's day when he was involved in law enforcement, that are looked at as pretty crude kinds of things to use as enforcement tools by today's standard.
Yeah, some of it's pretty, I won't say primitive, but
to some degree, probably, yeah, it might have been.
The weapons, we've got a display of weapons that were confiscated during various arrests, and we've got a collection of weapons that were used through the years by the Highway Patrol. And you can definitely see that evolution from what, now we hear a lot about law enforcement today on the news and whatnot, from, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but, from the days of small town, Andy and Barney, where you might have had the town jail with a couple of officers. With
zero training a lot of times.
Exactly, to the modern, well-equipped and highly trained, specialized kind of law enforcement.
I think it's good when folks see that building particularly, they get a more of a presence of the dynamic leap forward we have come in law enforcement. Of course, I know there's some out there would argue that we hadn't come that far and that we need to do a lot more, and I think as a society that's true. I want to move to a building called the Sports Hall of Fame building. Tell us about that. Do we have not only sports paraphernalia, but do we have sports icons from Sampson County?
Definitely. We've got, in the building itself, we have different trophies and photographs and articles from various people. And this is where I don't want to leave anybody, but there's people that I'd obviously heard of before I ever even thought about moving here, like Willie Parker, from the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then since I've moved here, learned about like Leonard Henry and Jarris McPhail that all played, in the NFL in fairly recent years. And then going back well before my time, we've had, multiple, professional football and baseball players pass through the different high schools and move on to the ranks of the pros, and women's basketball, volleyball, you name it. We have, quite a few local contributions to the sports world right here in Sampson County.
I find that interesting when we talk about sports also, that oftentimes when we talk about women playing basketball, and you look back at the 40s and 50s in those era, we don't really think about it that much, but there were a lot of sports, female sports games that were being played by women even back several decades ago, and we don't see that. Does that building kind of, I guess, highlight some of those things as well?
It does touch on some of that. There was some of the sports, like the women's basketball, volleyball, traditionally going way back were, more related to the girls at the high school or more available. And, in more recent years, it's become a whole thing unto itself with the WNBA and the college basketball. So you get even a sense of that kind of progression over the years, things that we might not think about as, true history, but it's all part of the story of Sampson County and the greater story of our country.
And it impacted culture and how we developed.
All right, it goes hand in hand with breaking down barriers and stereotypes. And
there's a building called the Exhibit Hall. Tell us a bit about that and how it showcases certain kinds of things as it relates to the school history and local schools and those kinds of things. Tell us what you would expect that would kind of intrigue people to maybe want to go to just that building.
Okay, the exhibit hall, I think, is probably one of the favorites for a lot of visitors, particularly visitors, local that have deep roots here in the county, because you got a little bit of everything. We've got information on the schools around the county, old movie theaters, some of the local businesses and companies, and then a lot of household items. And again, this is probably one of our most popular things, like old telephones, old washing machines, just things that you and I see around the house every day and don't think twice about. But 80 years ago they were vastly different, And then we got even some more recent things like the early cell phones that came in a big bag that you carried around, and now of course everybody's got a phone in their hip pocket. And
yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting in that facility or in that building as well is that it kind of gives you a dynamic, because as the things you just mentioned, a lot of folks are going, what? It hadn't always been in the palm of my hand. I couldn't take this and watch TV on it, and I couldn't send immediately a movie of what just happened. There's a huge group of folks that have never seen some of these things, and one of the parts of that building too also covers, quote, toys, which is part of building our life as human beings. I would submit today, maybe throw out to folks that are listening, to think about what was one of the first toys you remember having as a child.
Yeah, that's something that always conjures up a lot of memories for people. In the exhibit hall, we have toys that even they're still around today. Lincoln Logs and
building blocks,
dolls. Little like Tonka trucks and cars. These things have been around, since I was a kid and before that in some form or another. And it's sort of almost like when you look at that toy collection, it's almost like a timeline right there.
It is. We got a building called the Grange Agricultural Museum. Now, agriculture is major part of our life here, and a number of times, and I think even before you came on the air with us today, we were talking about the history and what farming and tobacco was, and a lot of folks that are listening to this show, I'm sure, like me, have spent some time in a tobacco field, not as prevalent as it was at one time, but was at one time the money crop. So tell us what in that building one will find as it relates to farm equipment and the history of agriculture.
One of the things sometimes I'll joke about with if I'm showing a group around or a family, I'll tell them that the entire history of farming is trying to find a way to do it easier. And you can see a little bit of that in that building. You've got the old mule plows, the old horse plows, the seeders, the corn shellers, the peat, these things that it was extremely labor intensive, and I think particularly with younger generations, or people that aren't from an agricultural community, just really don't think about it, don't have any context for. We mentioned we were talking earlier about some of the older visitors that will come through and talk fondly about their days working in the tobacco fields. And what pops in my head is, well, it was 100 degrees out there in the dead heat of summer. It couldn't have been that fond of a memory, but it's something, people feel warm and fuzzy about when they think back. And now we've got these $250,000 machines rumbling up and down the roads doing most of that work for us. And I think that's an important thing to put it all in context, because it is such a tremendous part of the history of this county.
It is,
and even today, it's still, I guess, the main industry here.
Yeah, and for North Carolina, it's about a $75 to $80 billion industry in North Carolina alone. So it is huge, and I just find it fascinating when I think about the Grange Agricultural Museum. That building itself, if folks just go there and look at it, and who has seen something called a cotton mop? I mean, you think about things like that, but people, when I say that, first of all, most folks maybe don't understand what a mop is used for, and second of all, much less a cotton mop, but you have one on display there that's part of it. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Chris Woodson, Director of the Sampson County Museum. We'll be back in one moment. Caller friends, stay tuned.
Give me a home where no burglar can roam, where my kids and their pets safely play. With security by Star, I can check in from afar, hit the lights, lock the door, night or day.
Really? Yeah, I can see my cameras, switch the lights, lock the doors, set the alarm, all from my phone.
Their prices are right, my home's locked up tight, Star Security makes me feel great.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I want to thank you for being with us today. The show is going really rapid today. I want to give a big shout out to all of our law enforcement folks out there to protect and serve us each and every day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We appreciate what you do, state, local, federal. We've got some very dynamic, well-trained folks, and we just love to kind of hold that up and let you know we appreciate you being there. And that kind of came up as a result of us talking about the Law Enforcement Museum. I wanted to be sure to get that in, Chris. We're talking with Chris Woodson here, who is the Director of Sampson County Museum. Chris, we're talking about some of the 9 different buildings on a 2-acre property at 313 Lisbon Street. We just talked quickly about the Grange Agricultural Museum building, which is just within itself is worth the drive to Clinton in to take a look at that. But then there's a building called the Bunning Log Cabin, and this is an original 1750s log cabin. What's unique about that building?
That's unique because in large part because of its age. If you think about the historical timeline, 1750s was very early as far as colonial North Carolina. This predates this Revolutionary War by about 25 years, and it's only about 15 years after the city of Wilmington was founded, and about the same time the city of Fayetteville.
That's got to be one of the oldest structures still left standing.
Right. It is. Within the context of that timeline, very old, back, like I said, to the earliest days of colonial North Carolina or pre-Revolutionary War North Carolina. We don't know a whole lot about the structure itself, the background. but it was found when they were clearing off the golf course, the land for the golf course in the neighborhood up north of town. Was it Timberlake?
Yeah, there's Timberlake still on
Right,
403.
they were clearing out that area, and there was an old farmhouse out there. They were going to have to tear it down, and when they started tearing that down, they realized that this cabin was inside it. So there's actually a newer structure built around the older structure, and unfortunately, it had suffered a lot of damage over the years. But we were able to. David was instrumental, David King, getting it transported to the museum property and getting it restored to where we can once again utilize it as an interpretive tool, mainly to interpret early life, or what we might think of as pioneer life or frontier life.
And it still has some of the original logs and floor.
Oh yeah. Some of it, a lot of it is still the original structure, and I think it's a valuable tool because it gives you an idea of what, back in those days, the western, what we think of as the western frontier, were these western parts of North Carolina.
You were living in it back then.
Never mind the Appalachian Mountains or the Mississippi River. It was the Cape Fear River.
I think it's also fascinating. We some weeks back we had some folks that talked about timber and growing new timber and how to ensure that we had ample wood supply, and some of the conversation was built around the grain of the timber. If you look at it and how trees during that period were the timber seemed to be very much stronger than it is today because it was not grown fast. This was basically virgin timber. So when you look at the grain in some of those pieces of wood, it's fascinating to see how close they are and tight they are.
Right.
Another building you alluded a little bit to a while ago, and we touched on, you've got one that's called the Civil War Cabin Museum. What will one find in there as it relates to artifacts? And when we're saying artifacts, I want folks to understand, we're talking about things that came from that era, that were created, that were handmade in many situations. What would one find in that building?
In that building, a lot of people from Sampson County are actually familiar with it. It was Claude Moore's building up in Turkey. It's called Log Cabin Road even today, or Log Cabin Museum Road. And he passed that on to the county museum. So a lot of that is from his personal collection, artifacts that people brought to him over the years during his career as a school teacher, educator, and local historian. And a lot of it is, we kind of loosely refer to it as the Civil War display, but it does have that. I mentioned the Confederate flag earlier from 1862, several old muskets and shotguns from the Civil War era, cannonballs, musket balls, but there's also a lot of other things, old antique books, old phonographs, spinning wheels. It's just a very eclectic collection of some really neat old stuff.
And that's, for a lot of folks may remember visiting that museum when it was outside of Turkey.
Exactly.
Professor Claude Moore, very well-known historian in this area. Wife Norma, I've knew her for years, and of course his daughter Susan. So I'm giving everybody shout outs today as I look back at my own relatively relationship with history. The museum itself calls up an era that for many people is a gateway to a very horrific and troubling time for this country. That's one of those eras that you mentioned earlier, that there seems to be a sense of such disparity that folks want to destroy it from history. Why shouldn't we destroy that?
As far as the Civil War?
As far as any history of it. I mean, you talked about taking monuments down, taking the names off buildings and those kinds of things. There's been a lot of news about that. Why is that not a good idea to do that?
I think it's difficult for us to get a complete picture of our past and where we're headed as far as our future if we don't have the complete, all the data, so to speak. If you're if you're going to do a news story, or you go collect as much data as you can, same way with history or writing a historical book or a documentary, or you want to bring in as much as you can and cover as many bases as possible. to tell the complete story. Otherwise, you're just kind of glossing it over. And I think that's really important because so much of this is tied not just to our past. I mean, we can't change the past, but we can impact our future, but we can't do that without, with incomplete data, so to speak.
I read one article, and I'm trying to remember the exact person, but the quote was, and this is a paraphrase, not a quote, but basically said we need to keep that visually and ever current in front of us so we do not replicate that same disaster.
Exactly. It's that old, the cliche, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it, or there's different variations of that, but the same thing. We'd be remiss if we forgot all this stuff, or we're just even when we do remember it, we still see ourselves getting into messes, repeating history, and it's. But I think it's important to preserve it and preserve it as truthfully as possible for future generations.
Couple of more buildings, and then we're going to be getting pretty close to closure of the show here. You got a building called the Holmes, Holmes House. Tell us what that is, and what are some of the things that you would find in there that relate to the mid-1800s?
Hey, that one is from around the mid-1800s, about 1850, give or take, and it has some connections to Claude Moore's collection as well. And we use that just as kind of a catch-all or generic display of items you would have found in, I guess you could say, like a middle-class household. Although there's some things that were definitely, there's an antique piano from 1852 that members of the Faison family purchased on their honeymoon at Niagara Falls and shipped it back down here, which had to be a massive undertaking back in those days. And it's just sort of a visual reminder of some of the extreme wealth that was around such a rural part of North Carolina back in those days.
Huge amount of opulence. Had actually pearled
keys, mother of pearl keys and inlays, and just really amazing piece of furniture, as much as it is a musical instrument.
The Wooten store, don't want to forget that, because that's a huge part of memorabilia here in the area.
Yeah, that's a favorite for so many people because it was located in Timothy, up in the northern part of the county. But it's typical. There were hundreds of these little stores all over rural North Carolina, or even all over rural America. I remember in my college days, before I-40, traveling 421 between here and going up to the mountains. There was, that's where we stopped along the way, was these little stores like the Wooten stores to get gas or use the bathroom back.
They solidified the communities during that period of time.
These were community centers. Oftentimes they were the post office, or they might be the only telephone in the community. It's where the old guys sit around, tell lies around the stove.
Exactly. It's where you took your eggs and exchanged it for flour and salt and rice and those kinds of things. So it has such a bounty of interest. We're kind of coming to that point in the show that, as I told you before going on air, it goes so fast. We've mentioned 9 of the pieces of that property that's on that 2-acre lot. Each one of these structures has its own story. Inside that is individual pieces that represent, as you mentioned, from the opulence to the aggravation to the torment of how we have grown in this area, and for the most part exemplifies Eastern North Carolina. Is there anything you would say to folks as kind of a closing commentary? I'll give you a few seconds for that as we come to closure.
Yeah, I think just in closing, just come out and see the museum. This is your history. This is these are your artifacts. This is about you. This is it doesn't do us any good to sit in there behind closed doors and keep this stuff to ourselves. This is available for free to the community.
If somebody wants to make a donation, they just call you at 590, and that's 307-590-0007, and either you will answer or Brittany Hayes. Does Brittany still work there?
Right.
Brittany Hayes is administrative assistant. So they can call if they've got something they would like to donate. Is it a nonprofit? If they donate something, is there a tax benefit to them?
Right, it is a nonprofit, and we'll provide you with paperwork. And it's not an automatic process.
Well, we thank you for being with us today and look forward to having you back to talk again. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking about history. Been talking about history at Sampson County, this region, this area. We look forward to seeing you again next week on the radio, and may God bless.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion regarding this or any episode, please send your emails to weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.